Welcome back. Here we are, halfway through. I hope that you're enjoying yourselves and that you've had a nice lunch and that you're ready for some more food for thought after the food. Okay. So, a couple of housekeeping points. Actually, there's been quite an interesting intercultural miscomprehension, which we'd like to rectify. The cocktail this evening, because cocktail dîner in French means buffet, big buffet. So if you were thinking that you needed to make a dinner reservation, please don't, because we have lots of food for you, and we're counting on you to eat the food. So that's a very important point. You know, there will be food for everyone this evening. And also in relation to that, the posters have been absolutely excellent, and they will all be down here with the poster gallery while we're having dinner. So you'll have lots of chance to look at everything while you're having dinner, as well as play with the photo booth, as long as the paper doesn't run out, okay? So I see the photo booth is proving very popular. We'll see how that goes on through the evening, okay? So that's the housekeeping for today. I'm going to now move into the more fundamental business of introducing our keynotes for this afternoon. So beside me, we have Robert Coelen from the University of Groningen. A few interesting points about Robert is he's actually a molecular virologist who spent 30 years in Australia. He's had a very long and detailed experience with internationalization and has gradually moved away from molecular virology to diversity climate, teacher education, and is currently at the University of Groningen at the Department of Internationalization. So he's here to talk to us about empowering students of higher education through diversity. And next to him we have Agnes Simon, or Agnes Simon, or Agnes Simon, which is a very interesting, also an interesting intercultural issue. She works currently in the Center of Teaching and Research at Comenius University. She's an educational developer. She's Hungarian. She lives in Slovakia. She did her studies at the CEU in Budapest, which has now moved to Vienna. And her original background is in political science. She's also lived for some time in Kyrgyzstan. So we're on the same format as yesterday. Robert will speak for about 20 minutes. Agnes will respond and interact in response. And then we will have 20 minutes with running microphones. And we hope that we'll have lots of interaction from students and from everyone in the room. Okay? So I think we've set up the contract. Are we ready to go? Almost. Okay. Maybe I have not pushed the buttons on the slides.
No.
Okay. Here we go.
It's all happening.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. And I think Robert would like to stand up and walk around, so I'll move out of the way. Okay.
And I've got an executive version of a talk that lasted just on an hour at Groningen University, so I promise not to speak 3 times as fast, but some of the slides you may not have enough time to read all of it. Joanna assures me that it will be available at some point after the conference, so you can have a chance to read it again. So, what's my aim today is to maybe not flip your mind, but maybe shift your mind map on diversity just a little bit. And I think that's because as academic institutions, we need to be a little bit ahead of the public discourse on diversity. And I'm hoping that my presentation will give you some inspiration to look at it a little bit differently. The things that we see at societal levels must come ultimately from the work of individual brains. And so it allows us going from a society level, and that's the take I'm going to use to get into this topic, we go to the individual. I need to tell you something about evolvability, and just your luck that I've been a molecular virologist, because I'll use a metaphor from the world of virology. I need to say something about innovations, and then the type of diversity that's the subject of this presentation, and how evolvability can mitigate the costs of embracing diversity. That has real costs, and I'll talk about that. And ultimately, a small peek into how we can operationalize this in education. I'm going to give you one important message. Joanna said I spent some 25 years on internationalization, and I'm not too proud to admit that we stuffed it up. We did it wrong. We thought that internationalization, like many, or rather the skills to be interculturally competent, shall we say that, could be taught by pouring plain vanilla sauce through the whole university. And whoopee-doo, we're all internationalizing and all is sweet and every student is going to be interculturally competent. Nothing is further from the truth. I have one PhD student working on policy documents and looking at what the gap is between these wonderful policy documents on internationalization and what actually happens in the programs, in the faculties, what's the reality for the average academic. I have another student looking at the interpretation of internationalization in different disciplines, and it's not the same story. So D&I, diversity and inclusion, let's not make the same mistake and think we can just wipe it through the whole university. Innovation, I think, is the motor of human development, and if you like, the thing that creates the cultural complexity that we see today. Everything to do with cultures in the widest sense. I put this slide in just to remind you that we're only somewhere around 2400 to 2500 generations away from when Homo sapiens spread around the world, interacted in some places with Homo neanderthalis and Homo denisovans, and we know that they interacted because all of you have a bit of genetic material either from one or the other group, more or less. And that dispersion has led to all of the different cultures we see today. 2400 generations. Genetically, nothing has happened in that sort of time span. So the cultures we see today are the result, in a way, of innovations, of adaptations to different environments that mankind has had to make in all the different locations where we've moved out to survive initially, and then to prosper. And I'll define, for the purpose of this talk, culture as the creation, transmission, and spread of traditions through social learning. And that's, I mean, there's since 1871, a whole bunch of definitions for culture. They more or less say all the same thing. Also, I think you can view a society as a collective brain. And that's sort of convenient to hold on to that for a minute. Yes, I know we all have individual brains, but think of society as one collective brain for the purpose of innovation. Okay, here's the virology lesson you're going to get today. Some of the things I will tell you is something very familiar to you today, but 4 years ago you would have looked at me and said, what's this guy talking about? Now, for this metaphor, just for a moment, pretend you're all a virus. And your desire to survive is just as big as the virus next to you. So that's the mind flip we have to make for a moment. And biological evolvability will help us survive. Let me show you that to you. Take a typical non-vaccinated cat sitting around on the couch, and a virus, a blue virus in this case, no, a red virus is floating around. No, it's a red virus floating around. The cat's breathed it in. It's not getting sick, really. And a few days later, this cat starts to exude virus particles because the virus has been internalized, it started an infection, and lo and behold, it's producing new virus particles into the environment, including, look at this guy, it's different. It's mutated. Okay, hang on to that. This is typically the view people have of a virus population, all red particles. But in most cases that's not so. The more likely scenario, and these red particles, by the way, with a non-vaccinated cat, each particle is totally efficient of starting an infection in the cat. Now, we noticed a viral disease of cats, so we started vaccinating our cats. And vaccinated cats, red virus particles don't grow so well because we made a vaccine against that variant. But in the population, and that's the normal case, there are different colored virus particles, green, yellow, blue. The blue characters can actually cause a full-blown infection in the cat. It's not hindered by the vaccination. What's the effect of that? Is that you get, after that, a mainly blue virus population. Now, you all know, with the corona pandemic we've had, the emergence of viral variants during the epidemic. What they didn't tell you, because they wanted everybody to keep vaccinating, was that each variant is most likely to be less disease-causing. Now, so much for the virology lesson. The changes generally with these viruses is incremental in nature. And many experiments, if you like, many changes, many variants are totally inviable, cannot infect a cat or anything else. So that population as a whole is not so efficient in creating an infection. Serendipity plays a role because these variants, all of a sudden the blue one pops up through almost a random mechanism. And the blue one happens to be the ones that are going to be able to infect a vaccinated cat and produce a new virus population. So what's going on here is that chance plays an important role in this. Now, if you look at influenza, its genes consist of little bits. When we get a major flu pandemic, that's because these bits have been recombined in a different way in a single virus particle. So recombination is a very powerful way to evade the immune system. Good. Another thing I need to tell you about, innovation. We hand out Nobel Prizes. And we think of these momentous moments where a fantastic innovation blows us all away. But the truth of the matter is, and I've picked here an example of where a surgeon needs to reconnect 2 bits of bowel. In 10 to 13% that goes wrong and you have a life-threatening condition because your bowel has fallen apart. That's not a very healthy situation to be in. And until recently, that was very difficult for a surgeon to decide what I sew together, will that stick together? Went wrong in 10% of cases. Why did it go wrong? Because they couldn't see that the blood supply ran to the end of the bit that they'd cut. But in the 50s, a French physicist saw something with lasers. 30 years later, an Austrian physicist colleague looked at it, and a year later a British guy. Incremental changes in being able to visualize moving objects. The British guy did it with blood. He says, hey, I can see blood move if I shine this laser on it. Fantastic. But it took another 20 years and a recombination of events, namely IT technology, video technology, to be able to get to another 20 years later, a laparoscopic device that when you shine that on the to be joined bits of gut, actually show the surgeon this is well perfused or this is not perfused. Incremental steps and then recombination to do something really amazing. So, innovations are made possible by incremental improvements, serendipity and recombination. And these are influenced, and I'm starting to introduce the term that I want to go to, sociality, and I'll explain it in a minute, transmission fidelity and cultural trait diversity. And recombination, just take it from me, I haven't got time to give you the proof, but recombination is has far more innovative power than luck or increment. There's evidence for this in academia. In 2013, 𝗘𝗺𝗃𝗏 and his colleagues actually looked at 18 million papers. And they asked themselves the question, what features is shared by papers in a plethora of disciplines that become highly cited? And they noticed 2 common properties. One, it was steeped in a particular discipline or a very tiny silo of that discipline, but it had an outlier. It had a colleague who didn't come from that particular discipline. and recombine knowledge out of two very different parts of our knowledge spectrum. And similar analysis with patents in the US showed that the most impactful patents were those that had an unusual combination of technology classification codes. So very disparate areas got together and invented something really fancy. So recombination is very powerful. What I'm talking about is this sort of diversity is cultural trait diversity. And that's what's the really important operative part. It's cognitively transmissible, and behaviors, assumptions, values, technologies, and other things that are cognitively transmissible. And I'm not talking about, and that's the public discourse, skin color, ethnic origin, sex, ability, gender, identity, socioeconomic status. I'm not talking about that as a classification of diversity. I stay away from that. We'll get to that. So CTD, cultural trait diversity, CTD between populations, as populations have adapted to local differences. Within populations, you get cultural clusters. Think of your institution as a cultural cluster, or think of faculties or departments in your institution as cultural clusters with particular traditions within a discipline or ways of thinking about things, and other clusters defined by some of these more visible and usually used versions of diversity. And within individuals, multicultural individuals, third culture kids, and interdisciplinary scholars. Now, we've had the collective brain, and we say the collective brain creates innovation. And I said there were three factors impacting on creating innovation. Sociality, which is really about the interconnectedness and the size of populations. The bigger a population, the more chance of finding new things. But the price is that if you have a very high network density, you start to get conformity. And large populations, you get coordination challenges. They'll come back in a minute. Transmission fidelity, I think you'll understand that. And with today's digital technologies, transmission fidelity is going up vastly. And cultural trait diversity, where variations in cultural traits across populations lead to the most significant changes in terms of innovation. The more opportunities you create for recombination, the more innovation you will have, but you have coordination challenges and inequality of outcomes. And I just want to focus on that in just a minute. So, CTD has a much greater scope to fuel further innovation when compared to the other two, sociality and transmission fidelity. And I do not have the time to explain that right now. But that paradox of cultural trait diversity helps you innovate is stymied by coordination and communication. Now, very important, CTD doesn't care about the source of diversity. It doesn't care. It's just there. Cultural trait diversity. And it's cognitively transmissible. So don't go... it may be related to some of the types of diversity talked about in the public discourse. I'm not saying that. But CTD, from an academic perspective now, I'm saying it makes no judgment calls about good or bad or indifferent. It's there. The diversity exists. I'm all for adding inclusion. Don't get me wrong. But what gets in the way of considering CTD is the human trait to use heuristics, to start stereotyping. Microaggression is, if you like, a very nasty form of human heuristics. That's not bad for someone like you. Whoa. You hope never to hear that anyone say that. So all these manifestations of heuristics get in the way and have us try and characterize. It's understandable that it's a very human trait. In prehistoric times, when Homo sapiens spread out over the world, probably ended up in places where there was stuff that was toxic and you ate it. And it was red colored and a whole lot of people got sick or died. All right, don't touch red things. That's a survival tactic. Interdisciplinary collaboration is recombination, but it's tough. We're geared, our whole academic world is geared at a certain rhythm of getting grants and then having a certain amount of time to work on that. If it's interdisciplinary, it's much tougher. And the first thing you need to do is to decompose the problem. Who's going to do what? To what extent is what I do to work on my bit of the problem going to affect you doing another bit? It's complex, takes time, and our systems don't give that. Simpler problems, of course, may not have the same difficulties. So you've learned about biological evolvability, which says some individuals in a population are not optimal for the current situation, but if the situation changes, they may well reign supreme. And I was triggered when Professor Willie Golden from Galway said, you know, I asked students, are you a leader or are you a follower? I think it depends on what's called for in a particular situation and whether you have the cultural trait repertoire that at that moment is optimal for the situation you're trying to deal with. So, cultural evolvability, I'm using a biological evolvability as a metaphor, and there is a lot more we could talk about how that metaphor keeps working. But it's all about cognition. And then you have all these sort of balancing acts. But you have to accept that if cultural evolvability helps you innovate, you have to accept some inequality and less than optimal maximum at the population level. And that's very important. And there is some pedagogical stuff that relates to that. I'll get to that in a minute. So, are you an efficient or a flexible company? People will give you an example of Nokia. Nokia was incredibly efficient and had very straight ideas about what a phone should look like and how it should perform. And they forgot to look around them. They didn't have a team sort of warning them that the world was changing and these phones that have no buttons were gaining ground. And Nokia went down. It was an efficient company, but not flexible. Flexibility costs money. The old expression is, oh, we have the boffins up there, and they're playing with toys and they're inventing new things. So it costs money. It has some risk associated with it. But in volatile times, a flexible company will be more likely to survive than one that's purely efficient. And in a multicultural society, the benefits of learning, borrowing, recombining traits associated with success, of course, are a good pointer in that direction. The other one that's important in cultural evolvability is tolerance for diversity. In societies where digressing from the norm has harsh punishment, you get a culture of stick to what we normally do. And in those cultures, you get more of a incremental innovation compared to cultures where a transgression or being different is in fact not punished very harshly or even embraced. Entrepreneurialism, people who stick their head out and do something different. Recombination is more difficult if tolerance for diversity is low. Now, I said that we'd go to the individual. The model that I really like, because it makes pedagogical sense, is to see someone's cultural trait repertoire as consisting of layers in terms of malleability, an age-dependent malleability. So from trait-like, more or less fixed by the time you're adult, to developmental, your norms and values, acquired, what you learn and experience, and exposed, the roles you take on. Watch someone's behavior change when they go from being a professor to being the president of a university. It's a different role. They have to exhibit different behaviors. So take that as a model of cultural trait repertoire. an individual is not, I just said we have multicultural individuals, but that is in fact also a single cultural trait repertoire with elements from different cultures. Look at this. If you accept this, that from these two babies to a doctor giving a corona vaccine to a policeman, there is absolutely an increase in cultural trait diversity in these two pairs of humans. So, I think we have what I would call an inverted trapezium of cultural trait diversity opportunities in education, where from pre-primary to higher education, the opportunities for diversity increase, for using diversity, for making students understand how diversity, cultural trait diversity, can help them. If I superimpose this model of Mello and Rentsch on top of that with these different layers, and these lines are arbitrary, by the way. I don't know how much this will change, how wide this will become, or is more or less only in the beginning. I've just drawn these lines. Very good. I will finish in 1 minute. So, if you accept that people have a wider cultural trait repertoire at an older age, then there is more opportunity to start leveraging that. I won't stop here, but teachers, by the way, we shouldn't wait till higher education to start helping students understand what they can do with diversity. It needs to start at this early age, and this example is of a young girl showing a young boy how to write the letter A. Neither of them spoke English a month ago, and she gives him instructions in English. The teacher, however, didn't see this as the use of diversity. And she hasn't made it explicit to the students why this little kid learned to write the letter A, how that worked, to make it explicit. I have other examples. There's ways of approaching diversity. I'm going to race now. With assimilation, just become like us, then all our problems are solved. Or colorblind. No, at the end of the day, we're all human, so we're basically the same. And of course, I think the more desirable approach, which is a multicultural approach, and how can I make use of the enormous cultural trait diversity that's available in my group of students when I make them do collaborative learning. Task is important. I flew past it with the notion of interdisciplinary collaboration, but a general appreciation of diversity is certainly strengthened by a task-related appreciation of diversity. And there's an example here in work. The paper will get published in not too far distance. This you don't have to read. I'm not going to say much about it, except it's a model of what you need to think about when you want to be a diversity-competent teacher. And we've modified the model of the original paper to be cultural trait. And thank you for listening to me.
Well, there's certainly a lot to think about there. Okay, and I'm going to hand over to Agnes, who has the job to react and to comment and to question. But for 10 minutes, maybe a little more, so that we have at least 15 minutes for questions and reactions from the room. Okay, it's a challenging subject.
All right, thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me. All right, good. So what I would like to do now is kind of offer a different perspective on diversity and internationalization and multiculturalism, coming from my own experience and from the region that I'm coming from. I think it will, at several points, connect to what Robert has just said. And I would also like to start with a caveat. So generalization have the problem of, right, it's not everyone. But I'm trying to kind of describe you general processing and mindsets. There are always exceptions to the rule. So just as Robert said, in Central Europe, and particularly in Slovakia, but I think it's applicable to basically all the Visegrad 4 countries, Hungary, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and Poland, we have our wonderful policies for internationalization. We have our wonderful policies at both the national and the university level. And something are being done to put them into practice, but most often it does not work out the way that it was intended. To give you an example, departments have to have courses that they offer for incoming international students, mostly Erasmus Plus and other exchange students. And they do create those courses, but in practice, those courses are not taught, or not taught in English. What is a general practice in many departments is that there's that one international student who would like to take our class. And so we're not teaching the 19 Slovak students in English, rather than we just have this class in Slovak. And then we tutor separately in our office the incoming international student. But that's not why he came or she came to our university. It's not a multicultural experience. It's not getting to know your peers. A different version of this is when we do have a large group of international students, those who actually enroll in an English language program at the university. My experiences are from, and it's not just Comenius University that I work at, but other Central European universities, that they, especially in the legal and medical fields, they run a program separately for international students and one from Slovak students, and they never actually talk to each other, as if the others wouldn't exist. And quite often, when we call attention to these facts, to these schools or faculties or specializations, they either say that, oh, our field is very global anyway, so we don't see a role for multiculturalism or internationalization. Well, medicine is global, it's universal. But the experience that your foreign students bring with you might be very, very different from what your local students have. And you can actually learn from that because, for example, there's a big difference in learning how to be a doctor in an extremely well-equipped hospital compared to being a doctor at a remote place where you have very little tools and equipment, and you still would like to cure your patient. Another experience is that I mostly looked at the kind of the instructional level or how we kind of approach this as teachers. But there are also students. Some of them are actually very happy with the foreign peers and very willing to hang out with them and talk to them. But there's this large group who has really very little international or multicultural experience. Remember that these societies are not multicultural in the same way and to the same extent, I'd say, as, for example, many of the Western European cultures. And most importantly, we're raised up with a mindset of how to be a good Hungarian, for example, rather than getting a more diverse view of the world. So when you get to the university, it's not that you necessarily are a xenophobic, you're probably not, but you not have an experience of talking to foreign people to that level that it would excite you. You're afraid that your grades will suffer if you take the course in English rather than in Slovak. Quite often you don't feel that you have anything to share. So I think as instructors, it's our job to kind of point that sort of thing out to them and offer them that kind of education where you can bring that experience in. Now, we also, Comenius University is an exception in that it's the largest university in the country. If there's any university that attracts foreign students, it's probably that one in Slovakia. But there are smaller universities which are not a popular target of Erasmus Plus exchange students, even if they are involved with these programs. So a good question that I'm struggling with actually is we need to give an international and multicultural experience to those home students studying at those universities if we want them to be able to work and thrive in a multicultural environment at companies at home, or if they are decide to go and work abroad. And so how do you do that when you have very little multiculturalism? There are some diversity, but those diversity are often not used for educational purposes because of fear that it brings more problems to the classroom than what benefits it have. It might not be true, but quite often we don't speak about those issues. Now, COVID-19 gave us an excellent example, and I say excellent in quotation marks, of what happens when you have no international students, even if at larger universities. We had the fortune or misfortune to run a course of internationalization. Some of our participants are actually in the current audience at the time when international students were not coming. And so we asked our participants to internationalize their classroom, to exploit actually the benefits of this international experience at a time when there were no international students in the classroom, and even if there were, the classroom was not a physical classroom, so it was not the same experience. And so many of them very, I would say excellently, turn into the idea of internationalization at home, and particularly internationalization of the curriculum. We can teach our students various perspectives without other nations or other minorities representing those perspectives. In fact, sometimes we find that just because you come to Slovakia from France, you do not want to represent France or the French view or the French government for that matter. So that's also a delicate issue of how to make people share their cultural experience without pointing them out and making them represent something that they might not feel happy and confident with. It is also possible to teach skills that are necessary at a multicultural and international environment without having such an environment. Communication skills can be learned, but some of our participants, which I was pretty impressed, picked up on such nuances as using a software to learn statistical analysis that are open source, free to access, and generally used in their profession. So if a student would like to get a job, they already have kind of the skills and speak that language of data analysis or that language of software that generally is used in the field. Now, one last point is something which maybe leave a bigger impression of our Western colleagues. We tend to think that decolonization of the curriculum is not a real thing or not something that's needed in our region because we're not a colonial power, we're not a colonial subject. We've been part of empires, and we might have been the minority in that empire, but we don't feel to have that colonial baggage. We might, but that's kind of beyond the point. And as some of our participants actually realized that having international students in the classroom, even if just a few of them, makes us more susceptible to the idea of decolonization and running into issues that we thought we wouldn't run into. Also, we might need to reconsider that our decolonization of the curriculum is not about colonies. It's kind of a different kind of minority. Because we do have minorities, just think about the Roma population, and we rarely ever teach anything in the curricula that's coming from their view and their perspective. So no wonder we don't really understand them.
Okay. Thank you very much, Agnes. So two very different... So two very different approaches to diversity in the classroom and culture in the classroom. We're going to open now for questions. So I'm handing the microphone to Amalia, who will run. And we're ready to take questions, comments from the audience. So there's one there at the back. So run, run, run.
Thank you so much.
Okay, go ahead at the back and then in the middle here afterwards. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, okay, thank you. So I'm 𝗂𝗂𝗃𝗃𝗃 from the University of Galway. Thank you so much for your rich contributions, and I'm so glad that you finished on that note around decolonisation. And I suppose we have a very similar context in Ireland. We say things like, we were colonised, we didn't do the colonising. And then we expect that we can't have then those rich conversations. So with our students, we have embarked on this notion of being a university of sanctuary, and that means taking a really proactive change. So we've been doing things like anti-racism training and stepping up to the mark and saying things and naming discrimination and racism. And as you mentioned, your Roma community, we also have an indigenous community in our context that are nomadic, and that ethnicity has only just gotten recognition. And we see extreme racism and discrimination throughout our educational programs, and that is then emanating at third level. So my question to you is really in relation to that notion of decolonisation and how, as a university, our academic programs can look to decolonisation within all disciplines, not just the social sciences, where maybe we speak to this a little bit more within our research. Thank you.
Okay, so brief answer from Agnes and maybe Robert, and then we'll take another question. But please, can I ask you to be brief, because I think we have a lot of questions.
Okay. So I might not be the best one to respond because I'm originally a social scientist. But I think all the disciplines, even in medicine or legal studies or math, the natural sciences, can add different perspectives or call attention to those instances where we have seen, if not necessarily an instance of colonization, but some sort of oppression or injustice. We do know that often in the past, when male scientists published, the wife was, or a female colleague was just as instrumental to the success of that project, but their name was not on the publication. So I think this could be something that can help even those fields that they think naturally not struggling with these sort of issues.
Robert, do you want to come in?
No.
Oh, not on this issue. Okay. Pascal.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for your talks. And as a microbiologist, I was so happy to hear about viruses, And so regarding this metaphor, you said about the basis for the innovation in the collective brain, that there was a kind of balance between sociality, transmission, fidelity, and cultural trait diversity. And I would ask you if you could comment on what could be the good balance between all those different aspects, because of course the problem is that we want to have the innovation of the collective brain the most efficient, but how to get the right balance for this?
Yeah. For example, sociality and recombination or cultural trait diversity work together. If you have too small a society, then your options for different models become less. So having a larger society, and when I say society, look at how English has become the academic lingua franca around the world, so that we have a shared language which has vastly increased the society that is considering problems. So that sort of works together. Transmissibility, I guess I'm only pointing at looking at my own experience of having a laboratory with 4 or 5 cabinets full of photocopies. And now all of that is A, obtainable in a jiffy, and B, sits on a very small part of my computer as the same resource. So getting access to information, getting access to good information has become a lot easier. That also, of course, pays into helping innovation. But the strongest is when you recombine different arenas and take a different look at something that within a particular scholarly scope has always been considered in a particular way. And it's a little bit like using cultural trait diversity rather than the public discourse of sources of diversity to create that shift. I mean, when I hear comments about decolonizing the curriculum, don't get me wrong, I'm all for it. But we attach values to things, and we need to undo that. And then when we undo that, the curriculum will not be colonized. It's a perspective. It's a perspective taking.
Okay, more questions, more observations? So, go ahead.
Thank you. To go back to this difference between diversity and cultural diverse traits, we had this questioning, at least I know in France, that some specific researchers are researching on specific topics because they are actually part of, for instance, a minority. So for instance, gay people researching on gay rights. So how do you deal with to get to the sources and maybe the limits of this cultural diversity trait?
I don't quite understand your question. You're saying someone is researching a minority, an aspect of minority that they belong to that minority, and what happens then?
Because you were, if I understood your presentation correctly, you're advocating more in favor of cultural diverse
Cultural
traits.
trait diversity, yes.
Sorry. Instead of diversity, how it is explained in the public policies. But in practice, what we see is that we go for this diversity public policy way to have actual research on certain topics.
Yeah.
For instance, having research on gay rights by gay researchers.
I understand your question now. That relates to what I mentioned, the heuristics. We like to take shortcuts. So why should we consider a gay person who's doing research work on gay rights? Why should that actually get those labels? It's a person investigating some aspect of a culture, really. I mean, gay rights is about culture. But we label it. As soon as you label it, you start to put it in a corner. And that's the public discourse. And I think in academia, we need to move away from that. If we don't lead, this discussion will not be resolved.
I'm a bit concerned by that, because there is research, and a lot of research, specifically from a feminist perspective, that shows that if you try to unlabel things, that the majority of people will still see it and consider it as if it was labeled. If you ask a lot of people, was this done by a woman or by a man, etc., and you use a gender-neutral term, in the heads of people, they will still think that it's a man. So how would you unlabel things? I can't quite see it happening.
Yeah, well, as I said, we label things because that's convenient. So we can classify it and put it in some pigeonhole. And what I'm saying is, it depends on, of course, what the research is, but the source of diversity is not so important as the thing you're investigating. The fact that it's feminist research, we've given it that label of feminist research, but what is it that you're researching? Something that part of our population is experiencing, is dealing with. You see what I'm saying? So it's, yes, we give it a label for convenience, but is that it's causing, I think, part of the problem of seeing diversity for what it is. Let me flip it. I mentioned and my talk had a different title at the University of Groningen. It was called Using Diversity as a Resource. And I immediately had people saying, oh, hang on a minute, you can't do that because you're going to use minority aspects to aggrandize or enrich the majority. Cultural trait diversity doesn't talk about minorities and majorities. It talks about the diversity that is. So it's, I see the struggle. I have to thank you for bringing it up. Why are we labeling? I'll need to do more work on understanding how you can get around that. But for me, in the purest sense, whatever source of diversity there is, I don't attach any value to it. Feminism has for different people different values. And so it gets categorized. And I'm saying we should stop that.
I would suggest you to read some Kenneth Burke. It's a rhetorician. And he always explained that even if we use language, whatever words we use, whatever symbols we use, there will always meaning be attached to it. So trying to come up with meaningless symbols.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that.
Other questions? So I think we should carry on. So it's a complex topic.
Very.
Touchy.
Also.
Questions? Remarks? Go ahead.
When unlabeling, don't you risk ignoring power relations and power imbalances, which are a huge part of why diversity is important?
Well, that's the same question as I just got, taking
but
away
it's
the
adding
label.
power, which
Sorry?
it's adding the topic of power, which is hugely relevant, I think.
In what sense?
Because power has shaped our world like it is today, and it will continue shaping it. So it's part, it needs to be included, and these discussions needs to be political.
So you're talking about the Willie Golden, Professor Willie Golden's, are you going to be a leader, are you going to be a follower? And what I'm saying is, depending on the situation, the power relationship may not at all be correct.
The back. There's a question in the middle at the back.
Hi. Sorry, that was a bit too loud. I have a bit of a question. From what I've been looking at and hearing a little bit, I might be wrong, but I feel like there is some sort of disconnect between the two of you. Is it possible that one of you is talking a bit more about the social sciences and the other one is talking more about the pure sciences? Because I do see where both of you are coming from, but I feel like there is some sort of miscommunication going around that it feels like you're talking about two different things.
Reactions?
I think to a certain extent we do speak about different things, but I'm not sure that it's because of our differences in background regarding the social and the hard sciences. But we do take a very different approach and focus on very different, I would say, aspects of the same thing. I'm not sure what Robert thinks about this.
Well, if I talk to my former natural sciences colleagues, they say I've gone to the dark end because for the last 7 years I've been supervising students doing a PhD in the social sciences. So I've definitely crossed over to the social sciences, and though I used the natural sciences metaphor, that was only because I thought it was very appropriate in many aspects to parallel cultural evolvability. So the difference in how we talked about it is evident to me, but I don't think that there's any control over that. Agnes's experience is what it is. What I didn't get a chance to talk about was that some of our research is now showing that interdisciplinary collaboration moves students up in intercultural competence using an instrument that's traditionally been used for measuring intercultural competence in relation to dealing with national and ethnic diversity. So part of my thesis of this cultural trait diversity is that the source is not important, and what we need to be able to deal with diverse others, whatever the source of diversity, is likely to lead to intercultural competence. The particular instrument looked at empathy, flexibility, social initiative, those type of things. And it's interesting to see that students who work with their colleagues from a different discipline actually move up in terms of their intercultural competence according to that instrument. So my whole thesis is when you can't do internationalization because you have no international students, start looking at other sources of diversity with which to confront your students and discuss why the meeting of two diversities, why that, what that yields in the way of ability to work with. My point about innovations is that recombination, that is, put it bluntly, the meeting of two different cultures, recombination is very powerful in inventing new things. 18 million papers being analyzed says so. 9 million patents being analyzed says so. When very different areas come together, you get impactful inventions, or you get impactful scholarship. So we had a different take here, and I'm advocating for this non-judgmental cultural trait diversity as a way of getting away from the value-laden labels that we give. And that doesn't mean we have to stop, and I didn't say that these more visible versions of or forms of diversity are not related to cultural trait diversity. I didn't say that either. I explicitly said they can be related. But please work with CTD as considering diversity rather than the more labeled and laden concepts.
Thank you.
I think we have to stop there. Okay. I think what is interesting is we've seen two sides of something which we need to go further on. I hope this generates more conversations. But it's the idea as well that diversity and is a value, a universal value that contributes to a rich education. And I think that's what both of you were saying. But at the same time, I think there's a very strong concern that we don't disrupt the voices of people who are not heard. And that's what the discussion is about. And I think it's very clear that that's not what Robert is suggesting. But it also shows how difficult it is to kind of say, okay, what is diversity in education? We all know it's good, and where do we draw the lines? Okay, and that's a political and a philosophical and an educational conversation. So I'll leave it there, okay? And I hope we can applaud our two panelists. Thank you very much.